Okay, so thank you everyone for being here today. We're really lucky to have with us Dr. Henk Poyser. He's a strategic lead for learning and teaching development, impact and recognition at the Queensland University of Technology, Academy of Learning and Teaching. And he is a really active scholar in SoTL, so he has published widely in the field, and he's also an associate editor at the prestigious International Journal for Academic Developers. So we do have a lot to learn from him today, and today he's going to be telling us a little bit more about teaching and learning exploration through the scholarship of teaching and learning. So thank you so much, Henk, for being here today, and I'll just pass it on to you.
Thank you, Namla, and thank you, Mark, as well for inviting me. It's an honor to be here, and thank you all for giving up your lunch break to come and listen to me. So yeah, the scholarship of teaching and learning. What I will do today is I'll talk a little bit about how I became involved in the scholarship of teaching and learning, because that's not an unusual way of becoming involved, and then hopefully that will make some connections to where you are situated yourself. Just before I came over here, I said to my colleague, I'm doing a seminar for NUS about scholarship of teaching and learning, and he said, "Oh, not everyone is very happy with the scholarship of teaching and learning." And so what he's talking about is that the very long, the very long-standing kind of debate about whether it's a good idea to separate the scholarship of teaching and learning as something that is different from research. And so I will touch a little bit on that, and I'll give you my opinion on that. And then what I'll do is I'll give you a few examples of projects that I've been working on, and they're often collaborations, which, well, when I say often, it's almost always collaboration. And they're often like interdisciplinary collaborations as well, which I think is useful and enriches a lot of these projects. And then I'll give you a few suggestions on how to find outlets for dissemination of your work if you choose to engage in the scholarship of teaching and learning. So I've got a few suggestions around that. And I'll finish up with a little bit of a discussion about something called public scholarship of teaching and learning, which is a kind of new direction which comes from SoTL has kind of developed in the last few years. And it is about how you take the scholarship out of the academy and apply it in public spaces that are beyond the university, basically, to have a wider impact, perhaps. Okay, so that's kind of the overview. When that title that I have is I've actually just seconded for a year. I'm normally a curriculum and learning designer, but strategic lead learning and teaching development, impact and recognition is just a fancy way of saying that I'm an academic developer. But the Academy of Learning and Teaching in which I work, they also oversee for the university evaluations. So student evaluations. And we also manage the national data sets around student evaluations, as well as student experience when they leave university. There's like national evaluations around that, and we get all that data, and we then turn it into what do you call it? Like consumable images for faculties to then deal with that. And it's actually quite, the reason why I bring this up is that it's often a starting point for the scholarship of teaching and learning. Because when you look at those large data sets, it provides comparisons between different universities, and it creates it creates rankings. Now, I have all sorts of problems with rankings in itself, but they are good starting points for discussions around learning and teaching and why some of the feedback we're getting might be not as good as it could be. And that then leads into potential projects around teaching and learning projects or scholarship projects. Right, so that's so a little bit about my background into this. I started off, my PhD is in screen and media studies, so media and communication. When I, back in 2002, when I finished my PhD, I started then doing sessional work as a lecturer at QUT actually, so I've come kind of in a wide circle back around. And then after a couple of years of sessional work and short-term contracts, I got a full-time job at the University of Southern Queensland, and that was in a student success, student support role, which then after a couple of years developed into academic development and working with faculty staff to improve their learning and teaching. I then moved to Bahrain Polytechnic in 2010. And my role there was to implement problem-based learning as an institution-wide approach to learning and teaching. Now, that's an interesting process, and it's a large kind of change process because you know, the institute had basically decided this is the way we're going to approach learning and teaching. And of course, everyone comes with a background in learning and teaching, and some have taught for 20, 30 years. So to say like, we're going to do something entirely different is not an easy process. But again, the reason why I'm telling you about this is because then as part of that change process, what becomes really important is to collect data on how well you're tracking, you know, how you measure success, and what is not going well, because you need to pick that up along the way so that you can do something about it. And that's essentially, again, that's essentially what the scholarship of teaching and learning is about. It's developing an evidence base, and it's using an existing evidence base to improve your practice and to improve student success as a result. Okay, so after, in 2012, I came back to Australia and I went to the Northern Territory where, to Bachelor Institute of Indigenous Tertiary Education. It's a dual sector institute, so it does vocational education as well as higher education. I was there as a strategic lead technology enhanced learning. At the time, they didn't really use any kind of technology at all. So students were kind of shipped in generally for 2-week blocks of face-to-face intensive workshops. And then they went back to largely remote communities. These are Aboriginal students primarily, who live very far away from the institute. So what tended to happen was at the beginning of semester, they would be flown in or bussed in for 2 weeks, a couple of intensive workshops, then they would go back to their community, and in theory, they were supposed to carry on studying until at the end of semester, there was another 2-week block of intensive workshops. In reality, all those weeks in between those 2 intensive blocks, nothing happened, right? So my role there was to use a learning management system and to use social media and other technologies to try and get students engaged in learning all the way through as a continuous process. Again, we needed to collect a whole lot of data on how that was tracking, whether that was successful. After 3 years there, I went to China and I worked at Shanjiao Tong Liverpool university for a couple of years as an educational developer. And in 2017, I came back here to QUT. And so I've since worked as a curriculum designer and academic developer here as well. So the common thread is the improvement of learning and teaching. But the reason why I'm kind of setting out these different contexts in which I've worked is that the scholarship of teaching and learning is very, very context specific. So it's very dependent on, you know, who your learners are, what their educational background is, what the cultural context is in which you work. And so all of that becomes part of your approaches to the scholarship of teaching and learning and of teaching and learning itself. Okay, so this is back in 1990, this was Ernest Boyer's conception of the scholarship of teaching and learning. His main argument was that we need to get rid of the teaching versus research binary and debate. And we need to engage with scholarship in a broader sense, which applies not just to research, but applies to all parts of academic life, essentially. So, and that's how the scholarship of teaching and learning basically was born as such. So he distinguished between, like prior to that, there's a scholarship of discovery, which is what we might call original research that advances knowledge. A scholarship of integration, which is about synthesis of information across disciplines, across topics, within disciplines, or across time. Scholarship of application, which involves the application of disciplinary expertise, with results that can be shared with or evaluated by peers. And so those three elements all come together in the scholarship of teaching and learning. So the scholarship of teaching and learning then becomes a systematic study of teaching and learning processes. Now, what I said earlier, not everyone is happy with this distinction is because universities are structurally, and particularly in terms of the way faculties are organized, they're structurally organized around the separation of learning and teaching and research. So when I say structurally, like, and you probably all know this, I doubt that it's different at NUS, but you get rewarded in terms of an academic career for research, not so much for teaching and learning. Like, this is changing a little bit, but it's still very much a kind of binary that is firmly in place in a lot of contexts. Okay. So Hutchins and Schulman made a distinction between excellent and very effective teaching and SoTL. And they argue that SoTL requires that faculty members must systematically investigate questions related to student learning with an eye on not only improving their own classroom, but to advancing practice beyond it. Now, to advancing practice beyond it is the key point here, because it means that the changes that you make or the research that you do into your classroom practice or a particular form of classroom practice, that you share that with your peers and that you offer that up for scrutiny by your peers, which is peer-reviewed research, right? So you publish it in peer-reviewed journals so that so that it stands up to scrutiny, and then you build on that. By the way, just as a pause, you will see that there's quite a few images of birds there. They have nothing to do with the content. So they're just there for if you get bored with me talking and you have something to look at, right? I like making photos of birds, so that's a little bit of background about that. Peter Felton, who until a few months ago was one of the main editors of the International Journal for Academic Development, and he's a fabulous scholar, by the way, and a very generous academic. He, in 2013, he came up with principles of good practice in the scholarship of teaching and learning. So the first one is it should be an inquiry into student learning. So what that means is like the ultimate aim should always be like, how can we make the learning experience better, or how can we help students learn better? The second one is that it should be grounded in context, and I've talked a little bit about that earlier. It should be methodologically sound, so you should have a clear theoretical framework and methodology around what you're doing, which is, again, it's very similar to, or if not the same, to when you do disciplinary research, right? So it's, except that it's applied to teaching and learning. So it's conducted in partnership with students, ideally. That doesn't always happen, but it's good if it does. And it's appropriately public. So the appropriately public thing is what I just talked about in terms of, you know, you share this in a public domain so that it can be scrutinized by your peers and critiqued. So Kern et al. In 2015 wrote a very interesting paper, and I've got, I don't know if Namla, are you gonna share the PowerPoints with people who are here? Okay, so I've got the link to that paper as well. Yeah. So what they came up with a taxonomy, and basically like they basically did a whole lot of research into different types of ways in which people talked about or practiced the scholarship of teaching and learning. And they came up with various lists from different papers about this. So it could be about what works well, so evidence of effectiveness. It could be about descriptions of what is currently the case, and then link that to visions of what could be the case, or, you know, how can we improve what we're doing. That then can lead potentially to new conceptual frameworks around learning and teaching. Just before you all arrived, we talked about hybrid classrooms. There's a lot of need to do research into the effectiveness of hybrid classrooms, for example. And so that can then lead to new conceptual frameworks around why you would do that, or how to do it best, or why not to do it, indeed, as the case may be. But you need evidence to back those kinds of statements up. Okay, so Nelson talked about reports on a particular class, like on a particular course or unit. It could be reflections from many years of teaching. Comparisons of courses and student changes across time, or very much like scientific experiments. So, you know, you set something up which has a control group, and so you can make comparisons. Secret et al. Have talked about data-driven classroom-based studies. Particularly in technology-enhanced learning contexts. And over the last few years, we've all engaged more and more in online environments. There are a lot of data that you can draw on if you know where to find them, if you know who to connect with at your institution to try and pull some of those data. If you then create an ethics application around that, you have a project. You know, which is based on potentially very large data sets, because the university collects a lot of data about what students do. And even the learning management system that you might be working in collects a lot of data automatically. All you need to do is try and figure out how to get access to that or how to leverage it. Okay, you can then do case studies. You can do presentations at conferences, reflective essays on teaching. All of this is part of the scholarship of teaching and learning. And there's no hierarchy here. It's all potentially valid if you have a good conceptual framework to set it up, and if you collect evidence to prove what you're doing. Okay. So in that same paper, they came up with dimensions of activities related to teaching. So the DART model framework, and I think this is very useful because it kind of shows you different dimensions of the scholarship of teaching and learning. So again, what I was saying before, this is not a hierarchy, but ultimately if you want to build a career out of this, or if you want this to contribute to your career as an academic, the peer-reviewed published empirical research becomes kind of your ultimate aim. But in the meantime, all of the other stuff here in this model is no less valuable, right? So because if you look in the private sphere, for example, in your scholarly teaching yourself or in the practice of your teaching, self-reflection on what you're doing is very valuable, and we do this all the time. Not just afterwards when we come out of the classroom, we do it when we're in the classroom. We reflect whilst practicing. And we think about what's going on here. Why is this not working? It was working yesterday, you know. Now afterwards you reflect some more. Then after a while you kind of start to compare different classes that you've taken. So why does it work in some classes? Why not in others? Then you try and find some literature around this, you know. Then you kind of talk to some colleagues about it. And ultimately, this then leads to a potential larger project that you can do, where you collect more data, where you collect more systematic data, and then this can then lead to a paper in the end that you subject to peer review, and therefore it becomes a publication. Now, if you do that in journals that are Q1, then this becomes part of your research profile, and your supervisor will be very happy with you. Right? But you do have to kind of discuss this because in my experience, and I work with a lot of scientists in the Faculty of Science, and I work with a lot of engineers in Faculty of Engineering, and there are quite a few supervisors who are not very happy with this kind of research outcome. You know, they want discipline specific research only, because, and in some cases they don't even count it. So you have to, you know, you have to be careful with it, and you have to discuss it, and you have to even advocate it in some cases, in some contexts. But in the main, and I'm not trying to frighten you about this, because in the main, most supervisors and most faculties will be happy with whatever amount of publications they can get. Right? So, yeah. Okay, so these are a number of journals that are specifically focused on the scholarship of teaching and learning. And I've put in there what they tend to, this comes from Kern et al. As well, but I've put in there what they tend to publish. So the Journal of Scholarship of Teaching and Learning publishes very traditional data-driven research, but also reflective essays. For example, they publish literature reviews or systematic literature reviews, and also case studies. So there's quite a big range. And the same goes for Teaching and Learning Inquiry, which is the journal that SoTL, that is connected to SoTL. If you haven't heard of SoTL, and I'll come back to that in a bit, but SoTL is an American association of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. It's a very large organization. They have big conferences, and they have a connected journal as well. So it's got quite a lot of prestige. The International Journal of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning publishes research articles and more conceptual kind of essays as well. Okay, so what I'll do next is, let me have a look at the time. Okay, I'm doing okay, I think. I'll talk a little bit about a couple of projects that I've worked on in the last couple of years. And I'll give you a couple of examples of what the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning might be about. Right, so in this case, there's 3 authors. I'm one of them, and Stephen Kickbush, who is my colleague, is another one. He's a learning designer, and then the academic staff member was Andrew Fletcher. He's a science academic, geospatial science academic. So, and he was teaching a geospatial course for second-year students. When we started off talking about this with Andrew, that particular course or unit, we call it units. What do you call it at NUS? So a course is a program, and a unit is what some call a course. So we call it units, which is a 12-week course, probably, but yes. So this particular unit had existed before, but student engagement was terrible. It was a traditional lecture tutorial kind of setup with an exam. So when Andrew came in, he wanted to change this around because he wanted students to engage with the materials more, and he wanted the assessment to be more authentic. And so we set about changing the unit. Now Andrew got very much, he got very enthusiastic about this. So he actually designed an app for this particular unit with the help of the IT department at QUT, and that meant that students had to go out into the botanical gardens with this app and collect a whole lot of data about different parts of the botanical gardens. They then had to go through a process in groups of cleaning all that data, and these became large data sets because each student did this by themselves. So, and then they had to go through a whole process of so cleaning the data and working on a report at the end of it. And the report came in a recommendation to the Brisbane City Council about how to make improvements to the botanical gardens. So that's quite an authentic way of approaching this. So then we decided to create a scholarship project around this. So we collected, so what we did was a mixed methods approach. We did student surveys over a period of a couple of semesters. We did focus groups. And then we looked at student results in the unit as well. And the focus, as I said, was on authenticity. Now, the interesting thing about this, when we started talking to students about this new approach, they did a lot more work in this unit than they did in any other unit, because they actually, and that was partly because they got very engaged in the process of collecting and cleaning the data sets. Now, initially, they weren't very keen on this, but by the end of the semester, they could see that this was going to benefit them in all their other units and in their profession later on upon graduation. So we then started to use this data and we did an ethics application, so we could then publish about this. And I've put the link in there so you can have a read yourself if you find this interesting. But this is basically, then led to a publication around this. So the second case study, quite a different one. This one was just published last month, and this is based on postgraduate supervision. So Robin and Megan and myself were the supervision team for Sazan. And so Sazan is based in Erbil, which is in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. She's never been to Australia. We've never been to Iraq. So the whole supervision process, and she's just passed with minor corrections 2 days ago. So this is a very successful outcome. But we've supervised her by distance over the last 3 or 4 years. And it's a very her thesis is about peer education in refugee camps and internally displaced, and camps for internally displaced people, largely from Syria at the time. So it's a challenging context. And so the way we supervised that was with different roles. Each of us had different roles. We used a whole bunch of different technologies so that we could be very responsive. During her studies, there were all sorts of dramas, like all sorts of serious dramas, as in, rockets being fired into the town. ISIS was still active when she started this research. There was natural disasters, and there was COVID-19, of course. All of this impacted in various ways on her data collection. So, but basically this paper is, we set this paper up as a scholarship project, and we used critical reflection on the way this supervision arrangement worked, right? So the conclusion was that we basically turned this into, we basically tried to remove the hierarchy of supervision and student, and we turned it into essentially a learning community because we didn't know much about the context in which Sazan worked. She needed to teach us a lot about that context. And then together, we would, for example, need to teach the ethics committee at the university that certain things were unusual and that they had to make exceptions, otherwise this project would never succeed. So, and we then became Sazan's advocates in this process as well. So we turned it into basically a learning community of peers. So again, that link is there. So if you're interested in this, you can have a bit of a look. I'll speed this up a little bit. So this one was published this year as well, and Andrew Fielding, who is the main author, he worked together with Stephen, myself, and Praneet, and we're all learning designers. So it's a similar kind of setup. You know, Andrew wanted to change things around in his unit, so we created different activities, and then we did some evaluation of that, and collected a whole bunch of data around it. Then we did another round of making improvements, evaluating it again, and so on. And so eventually we started that in 2018. So it's a kind of 4-year process, but this is now published in Physica Medica, which I'd never heard of, but is a Q1 journal, and it's a very respectable journal in medical physics. Right, so this is what we're currently working on. This has been in process for about 2 years now as well. So hopefully in the next year or the year after, we'll get a couple of publication outcomes from this. It's a forensic science unit, which used to be interdisciplinary, but basically it was broken up into week by week lectures, and lecturers from different disciplines would do a lecture each in those different weeks, and they never met. You know, I met at the beginning of semester, and then you do this lecture, you do that lecture, you do that lecture, and then there's an exam. So there was not much interdisciplinary engagement. And so what we decided to do was change this around and design it from the beginning in an interdisciplinary way. So all the lecturers that were involved in this unit, as well as actual forensic scientists from the outside, from industry and government, would come in, and we formed a group to design this unit in a more authentic way. And now we're going through the process of collecting data about how successful that has been. It looks like it's been fairly successful, so that's good news. So this is to be continued. Okay, so what I've talked to you about now is a couple of examples of how to do this. Now, I'm presuming that there's educational developers at NUS as well. I know this because I know some of them. And so feel like what you should do if you're interested in this kind of work and you see opportunities is to get in touch with them and see if they can help you make some changes to your learning design in your units or courses, and then try and figure out and brainstorm some potential projects around this. Okay, now I showed you some journals that are specifically focused on the scholarship of teaching and learning. But in many cases, it's a good idea to actually publish in discipline-specific education journals. Now, the reason why I'm saying that is because your faculty, it'd be easier to sell this idea in your faculties, and because those journals tend to be high-quality journals as well. So, for example, in engineering, there's a Journal of Engineering Education, and there's at least 2 or 3 others. In nursing, there's a whole lot of journals that are about nursing education. Nurse Education Today is one of them. Again, there's a whole bunch of others. There's a Journal of Education for Business. And there's Chemistry, Education, Research and Practice. Each discipline has education-focused journals attached to them. And those are good options for, if you're looking at publishing some of this kind of work. Now, the previous example of Physica Medica, that's not actually an education journal at all. And it's not a physics education journal. It's actually a medical physics journal. that occasionally, when they like the paper, will publish an education-focused paper. So that's even worth considering. And if you do that, it's usually a good idea to contact an editor of such journal and ask if they would potentially be interested in an education-focused paper before you spend a whole lot of time investing in that. Okay, so these are some, I've already mentioned these are some specific SoTL-focused journals. And then there's also like broader, more general higher education journals, such as Higher Education Research and Development, or if you have a technology focus, the Australasian Journal of Educational Technology, and there's a bunch of others, the British Journal of Educational Technology. There's actually quite a few. So plenty of opportunities and plenty of outlets if you've got a good project. Now, this is a very recent book by Nancy Chick and Jennifer Fryberg, who are long-term members and leaders in SoTL in the US, and they're both connected to iSoTL as well. They've come up with the idea of public scholarship of teaching and learning. Basically, the idea is to take the scholarship of teaching and learning outside of just the academic community. It's based on broader concerns about academic knowledge, right? So in the last few years, what we've seen is the growth of public knowledge that is not very rigorous and that has real political and social and economic impacts. So their concern is that all this knowledge that is based in academic context doesn't find its way to the wider public. And so there's a lot of misinformation out there, and we as a SoTL community need to engage with this problem and step outside of the academy to make what we do more publicly accessible, right? So that's their main argument, which they first brought up at the iSoTL conference in 2019. And so they wanted to extend the purpose of SoTL towards advocacy, a broader public, more public forms of communication, and there are many potential forms of communication. So you can think of blogs, of social media. There's a whole lot of different ways of. Now, when we say public and academic, the two can go hand in hand as well. Like, so, for example, if you have published something in an academic journal, you can then write a blog about it. You can promote it, its key findings in various other fora, seminars, newspapers. So that's kind of the idea. Now, at the iSoTL conference later in the year, this experiment is being trialed for the first time. So there's an international collaborative writing group, which is about public scholarship of teaching and learning. And so I'm one of the leads in managing these groups, and then we have a bunch of facilitators, and each facilitator has a particular project, and then there's a number of participants as well. So they all come together at iSoTL, which is in Canada, in November. And so hopefully I'll be able to update you on the results from that later on and maybe sometime next year. But keep an eye on that. And I'm now looking at the clock and I'm now rambling on for way too long. So I'll leave it here. And like I said, some of this stuff, Namla will share the PowerPoints with you. So, but if you have any questions, comments, I'm very happy to have a bit of a discussion about this. Thank you again for having me.
Thanks, Henk. That was really useful. I think especially because there's just so much information out there about SoTL. It's so big, as you said, just entering into it. It's nice to have someone who's sort of been working on it for a while now and is a little bit more familiar with the types of journals and different avenues for publishing, etc., to see you kind of come out and tell us a little bit more about that. Yeah, so I'll just see if anyone wants to start off by asking a question. I will share Henk's slides along with the link for his talk, the recording for his talk later on this week. So thank you so much for already sharing that. Mark, do you have your hand raised?
Yes, I do. Thank you so much, Henk, for the talk. I do have a question about what you were talking about just now and making it public. We have a centre blog as well, but we're finding, that people tend to choose other sources as outlets, ones that have impact factors, etc. Are you finding that the use of blogs is growing? If it's a summary of a paper?
Yes and no, but it takes a little bit of work, Mark. Like it by itself, like if you have a blog, you write a blog, you spend time writing it, then you put it out there, no one will necessarily go and read it. So you have to really promote it, and so there's a lot of this. Making it public is about cross promotion in a whole lot of different platforms. Now, it has benefits because it actually makes people more aware of the initial study, and it makes people more likely to then look at that and read your actual paper. But yeah, it takes a lot of time and effort, and it's I work here at QT. We've just set up a new research group last year, which is called Digital Learning for Change, and we're kind of going through this process of trying to get people engaged with what we're doing, and just simply opening a Twitter account and tweeting a couple of times a month is not going to do it. You've got to really work at that. And you've got to assign someone to invest time in doing that. And so, because there's so much, like as you say, there's so much material out there, and you're kind of screaming amongst a whole lot of noise. So you've got to kind of find ways in which there's a consistency to your messaging, and there's a clear kind of message that cuts through, which is not easy. Like it's hugely challenging.
I suppose one way that we try to do it is to kind of put across the idea that the centre's blog is not necessarily the same kind of genre as an academic paper. It can be shorter, for example, doesn't need to have as many references, that sort of thing. But it is proving to be quite difficult to encourage people to use the blog to publish. Yeah,
but by public, we also mean things like magazines, newspapers, something like The Conversation, for example. which, you know, it's still largely read by academics, but it is also read by a large cohort beyond academia. So, and it's got a big following. So if you could get something in there, that's a good idea. And then again, then you kind of tweet about it, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
I was also wondering about, like, jumping off Mark's point, how I've noticed that sometimes it's the tweeting, the blogging, the public aspect of it comes in a well-established career, in a sense. I feel that the younger academics or anyone who's just trying to get in wants to publish in the journals with the high impact factors, get recognized. And then I thought it would be the other way around, but then you have, you know, people who have a voice, who are, you know, well respected, who start to have, you know, books and publications and, you know, papers, keynotes. They are comfortable with blogging and tweeting and having a presence on social media because they know that what they say, and promoting young academics as well. I find that is really, really amazing, that a lot of some of the groups that I'm a part of, they're wonderful at, you know, shouting out to young academics and new PhDs and things. But I feel that there's something going on about, you know, the other side of the career as well in terms of a trajectory, right? Which is interesting and not something I expected in a way.
No, it's very interesting. I agree, and it relates to problems around imposter syndrome, and, you know, like feeling like you can't really confidently. But I think I think having something published in a peer-reviewed journal gives you quite a bit of confidence, you know, potentially. So and I agree with you. Like if you only, I mean, I even sometimes hesitate to put an opinion on Twitter about something because I feel like, do I know enough about this? You know, like maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should do some research first. You know, which is, yeah. But once you're tweeting about something that you've done a whole lot of research into, and that you've published about something which has gone through peer review, there's nothing stopping you really, you know, because it's already been through a process of scrutiny. So, yeah, I think that potentially builds confidence. But that's another reason as well why I think collaborations, especially for scholarship of teaching and learning, are really important. You know, because another thing about this is that most discipline academics are not necessarily engaged with a whole body of research around learning and teaching. So, and it's not easy to catch up on that. And so that shouldn't be a reason to stop you. But if you then collaborate with someone who does have that background, then the collaboration is powerful, you know. So that example that I showed you earlier with medical physics, I know nothing about medical physics, but I know something about learning and teaching, you know. So the discipline-specific parts of that paper, I still struggle to understand myself because I didn't write them, but you know. And so, but the combination, I think, is powerful.
Yeah, I was just thinking though about, you know, collaboration. I don't know how your institution views it. I mean, in ours, certainly it's different according to different faculties and how they view things like first authorship or how large the group is. You know, there's also certain dynamics within that are not entirely transparent. I think CELC is moving towards acknowledging collaboration. So we've been lucky in that sense that now, you know, you don't have to be first author, but that's certainly something that was historically valued. Because it's somehow strangely, the suggestion is that if you're first author, that somehow you're the one who's, you know, coming up with the idea and, you know, conceptualizing things. And then the second author is somehow your research. I mean, I don't mean it like that, but that's how it's viewed, like the person who's just, doing the legwork in a sense. So yeah, I don't know, how do you navigate that? Because that's a tricky one, I think, because I certainly agree with you about the great collaborations. I have had amazing collaborations at CELC with colleagues like Mark Brook and Dr. Letitia Monbeck, and we write a lot. We've worked with nursing, so we've had amazing, research and collaborations coming out of that. But then, if from an institutional perspective, that's not as valued maybe in than single authored paper.
No, and you're right about that. I mean, this is, see, from my perspective, I come into this as an academic developer. So I'm happy. And when I say I'm happy, I used to always be happy to be last, in any of these projects. It didn't really matter if what percentage of contribution I made. But I've been told by my own supervisors that this stops you from getting promoted if you don't have enough first author papers. So it's definitely a problem, and so there's a lot of so you have to be very careful, and as part of your collaborations, you have to be quite explicitly talking about this early on in the piece, I think. But it's the reason why, because from my perspective, it's important that people engage with their learning and teaching and trying to improve learning and teaching. That's part of my job, right? So I'm quite happy for them to be first authors because they get then the recognition and they don't run into the problem that you've just described. Of course, that means for me that I run into that problem at some point.
Yeah.
But
it's
I don't.
Fun. Yeah, because some in some fields it's very straightforward. It's just alphabetical.
Yes.
Then it's, I think, amazingly fair because then it's not ranked according. I mean, if you are anyway, you have to justify your contribution, right? So if you are doing it for something like promotion, you have to say I wrote this bit or I did this part of the research. So you're expected to justify that contribution. But I think at least that makes it a little bit fairer, or like circulating. So I think we've been quite lucky in our project with nursing that we've circulated, and even the nursing lecturers are very straightforward about circulating. So they'll be like, I was first author last time, let my colleague be first author next time. So we try to give everyone an opportunity, unless they conceptualize that paper and did come up with the idea and did get into the special issue or the journal or whatever it is, for everyone to have a chance to sort of have a not be fifth author, especially because it's a large project.
Yes, and I think that's a good way of approaching it. I mean, the ones that I've talked about are kind of one-off projects, but I've been part of larger projects as well, some of them funded, where you kind of go through a process right at the beginning that says, okay, this is how we're going to carve this up. And, each of us will take a leading role in part of project or something with a specific focus, so that you all get the benefit of having at least one first authored paper. I saw this one, there's a question here in the chat. I continue to struggle with understanding what the relationship is between SoTL and the traditional discipline of the study of education. That's a very good question. I struggled for years with that distinction. I think the scholarship of teaching and learning is very much higher education focused. The discipline of the study of education is often primary and secondary school and early childhood. That's the way it's at QUT anyway, like the Faculty of Education, or what used to be the Faculty of Education, used to not do higher education research or teaching related to higher education, which is odd because I think it's part of the same continuum. But that's the distinction. So SoTL is very much higher education focused, and it's cross-disciplinary. I don't know if that answers your question. But
and presumably it also means that you can enter from a different perspective, right? You don't have to enter from the higher education research perspective. You can enter from the discipline of nursing, whereas in higher education, you would always have to situate yourself in the literature from an education research perspective, and then enter into the discussion about what your specific paper focuses on. But in SoTL, you can go the other way around.
that's right.
Different. Yeah, different and challenging as well in many ways, like you said. Hi, Letitia, you have a question?
It's just to add to this. One difference I find is also about ethics. In educational research in primary and secondary levels, you tend to have external researchers entering the space and then somehow making judgments about what teachers do. And I find that, I mean, there are discussions about this, but I find it very ethically problematic. And it's always in a paper written quite quickly. There's no denying the teachers are very dedicated. However, most of the paper is about what they're doing wrong. So what I like about higher education and us taking, that into our realm of responsibilities is that we keep control of that. So we can be very critical of our own practices, but we are the ones who have the experience of it, and we can actually probably judge and research more effectively. So it was just a comment to add to that distinction between the two. I don't know if Hank, you have anything to add.
No, it's a very good distinction, and I mentioned this earlier, but there's a real. See, in education, you're talking about teachers who are educated to teach.
Mm-hmm.
In most academic disciplines, we don't get educated to teach.
That's
We
right.
get educated in our disciplines.
Mm.
So in the practices of our disciplines and in research, mainly. So this is part of the why SoTL is important as well as because it's part of helping people to know how to teach. And it's a strange, I mean, when I first started teaching myself, I had no idea how to teach. Like I had 1 hour kind of induction of like the tutors were thrown together, and this is and most of that was about how to claim your pay packet at the end of the day. And then, at 4 o'clock, you go and teach this class.
Yeah.
So I went into that class and asked them a question because I thought, they're going to want to discuss this. And no one said a word. And so within 15 minutes, I'd run out of all the material that I had to prepare. And I was freaking out because I didn't know what to do with 25 people in front of me. It's a scary process. And so you learn very fast.
Yeah.
And you start to experiment. But the point of that is you don't get taught how to do this. Now there's slowly improving practice around this, and there are opportunities to learn how to do this. But I mean, in the unit that I'm working in at the moment, we offer a lot of professional development. We offer a lot of workshops. Everyone is time poor, so no one shows up for those, or not many, unless there's some kind of external motivator to do that. But yeah, so, and most people think like, I know how to teach.
And also it impacts at the end of the road in terms of things like evaluations, right? I've been in a session like that in CDTL where an assistant professor was crying because they didn't get tenure, because even though they had everything on the research side, the student happened to say that and the words she uses, they hated me. I mean, I shouldn't be delighted by that. I mean, I was so horrified at the time.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, oh my God, I can just imagine she has no experience in teaching, and she's gone into the classroom and the students are literally writing things about how much they like really, really strong negative comments. And then she's just been told, I'm really sorry, but based on these comments, we can't put you up for tenure. And, you know, she was devastated. So it was one of those moments where you feel like institutionally she was being let down. And CDTL was well aware of that. And they were like, look, we're going to help you figure that out. But, you know, you really need to, it has real consequences for people down the line. Even people who are just on research-oriented tenure-based tracks, right? Whereas in NUS, we're divided into two ways, education-based and then research-based. We have two tracks.
Okay.
And, yeah. So there it's good in certain ways. It's very, very good in the sense that you get acknowledged.
So the question about that. So if you're in the teacher focus track, is the scholarship of teaching and learning valued in that track, or is it?
Yes.
So you're still encouraged to publish, but around teaching and learning.
Yeah, so the question is, I mean, and it depends again institutionally how it's defined, whether, you know, if there's somebody who's good in their disciplinary research, does that get acknowledged as well? And now it is being, so you can be a researcher who's, you know, publishes in linguistics or sports sociology, whatever your area of interest is, as well as, you know, showing scholarship of teaching and learning. So you're kind of double hatting a bit there, but it's it is very much valued, the sort of education focused research, which is really fantastic, I think, especially when you're a dedicated teacher and you think of yourself as being in the classroom, and that's part of your identity as a professional, I think. Mark had a question about a case study. You just put it up on the chat. On the long case study. Over 2 years, have you any tips on how to keep up with a consistent level?
It's hard to find time. That's a good question, Mark, because we don't always set out for this to happen. So the one that I'm working on, that I mentioned, the forensic science one, we actually set out to have one intervention, one semester, do all the evaluation, and then publish a paper at the end of it. But you know, that hasn't happened, and a lot of the reason for that is these kind of time pressures. And it's not just our time pressure; it's also, especially also the academic staff time pressures. You know, so and so as a result of that, we then said, like, well, you know, there's a new semester starting, we might as well collect a bit more data, and then we have a comparison, and then we can add more depth to the paper eventually. You know, so that's kind of how that goes. The initial aim is always to do it a lot faster than what it eventually than what eventually happens.
Do you find that you know, having regular meetings or sharing out the tasks, are there certain kind of tips that you can give?
Yes, definitely. And what we also find, or what I also find, is that we tend to stay involved. Like, so as a learning designer, you have input right at the beginning in the design of how you set something up. But the important part to me is always the follow-up. You know, so we always try and set it up so that we come in to the classroom and do some observation, like all the way through the semester at various points in time, to just see how it actually operates in practice, and so that we can also still intervene if it's not working very well, you know. And so we kind of have a whole plan that involves regular meetings, yes. And I think it's a good point, because I think it's very important. If you don't do that, it will wither away and go by the wayside.
I suppose you also have to have a good culture of open classrooms. I mean, that's also quite hard to build.
It is. And that has cultural elements to it as well. It's harder in some contexts to do that. We had something which we don't currently have, but we used to, and it was called pulse evaluations, and they happened at about week 4 or 5. So students did feedback in week 4 or 5, early on in a semester. And then everyone who had really bad feedback, and some of it was shocking, the paper that I've started off talking about with Andrew, because his students were used to sitting back and listening to lectures and then going to tutorials and listening to some more lecturing, the moment they were asked to get out of their chairs and do lots of work, that they were not very positive about it, you know? So at week 4, they were kind of whinging and complaining, and the lecturer made them do stuff and they couldn't see the point of it and all of this. And so it wasn't until the end of the semester that they became a lot more positive about it. But as a result of those, because what happened with those Pulse Insight results, they went to the head of department. So the head of department then came to us with a list of, these people have really bad results, you have to go fix them, you know. So we then contacted them and often started conversations around, you know, what can we do? And because, like you say, Namala, it's very distressing to get horrible student feedback. So many academics who do and who feel like a lot of stress, and then, you know, they're quite open to getting some help. Yeah, and then if you can then turn that into a SoTL focused project to get some benefits at the end, some wider benefits at the end, I think everyone wins in that process.
Mm. Yeah. Any other questions? Thanks, Henk. That's a really good point, I think. I mean, so many, I guess there are a lot of people who are working. Teaching can be a very lonely profession in a sense. And then at the end of it, you're evaluated by someone who doesn't understand the classroom context. So it's really valuable to have people sort of come in or help you and have that kind of open culture in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing we do about that is usually we have conversations in advance of, we don't just come in. We kind of talk through what we're going to do. And then we also sort of talk to academics about if there's anything in particular they want us to even focus on, you know, or yeah. And so that's always helpful. So they kind of have a bit of a stake in what you're doing. You know, they're engaged in the process rather than, yeah, if you just come in randomly, it feels like someone is checking up on me. And that shouldn't be what it is. Because that's not very helpful at all. But it's intimidating to have someone at the back of your classroom watching what you're doing. You know, it takes time to get used to. No matter how friendly they are.
Are there any other questions? Because if not, I'm just looking at the time and I'm just gonna say thank you so much to Henk for today. That was a really useful session. So as I said earlier, I'm gonna share the link to this talk as well as Henk's slides, which he so generously shared with us, which have all of the links to the different kinds of journals he was talking about. And will be really useful for our colleagues, I think. So thank you so much, Henk, for being here with us today. We really, really appreciate it. That was really insightful. And we will be sending you a book voucher to say thank you very much for.
Oh, I need to do that, but thank you. Thank you for asking me. This was fun.
Thanks, Henk.
And all the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks, Hank. That was amazing. Oops. Okay, he's gone. Thanks, Halim. Bye-bye.